Thank you all for coming to this afternoon DEFCON session about the adventures of AV in the Leaky Sandbox. Together with me, we have here Itzik Kotler, the CTO and co-founder of SafeBridge, and yours truly is the VP Security Research of SafeBridge. So what we are going to cover today is exfiltration from highly secure enterprise. We are talking about mainly two scenarios. One wherein the enterprise has its endpoints with restricted internet access. That means that only traffic to a closed set, very small closed set of whitelisted hosts are allowed per endpoint. Such hosts can be, for example, Windows Update servers, antivirus servers, and so forth, hosts that are really needed for the proper functioning of the endpoint. And the second variant is even stricter, wherein endpoints simply do not have any internet access whatsoever. They do have, of course, visibility into the enterprise network, wherein a set of update and management servers reside on a separate LAN segment that are allowed to access internet hosts, so that the endpoints eventually pull or get pushed with Windows updates and antivirus updates from the management servers that reside on premise. So let's say now that instead of traditional antivirus, we have cloud-enhanced antivirus. Obviously, a lot of people now are in love with the whole cloud theme, wisdom of the clouds, and so forth. And obviously, a cloud enhancement is, as the name implies, an enhancement. What can possibly go wrong? So we say that yes, something can go wrong. Adding cloud antivirus can degrade the security of the endpoint. How? Like we said, we are going to exfiltrate data from the enterprise. Again, we are assuming that we are talking about highly secure enterprise with restricted or no direct internet connection for the endpoints. And we're going to use the cloud antivirus to actually exfiltrate data from the endpoint, where with traditional antivirus, we could not achieve this goal. An important property of our attack is that the attacker can be anywhere in the internet. There's no requirement for the attacker to be in proximity, either geographic or network topology wise. So for example, we're not talking about necessarily an attacker that resides on the same ISP or that attacker that owns ISP servers and so forth. The attacker can practically be anywhere on the internet. And the feature of the cloud antivirus that we are going to exploit is the antivirus sandbox. Before I describe the technique, we're going to go very quickly on some related work to make sure that we understand the context of this new attack. So obviously exfiltration at large is already known and researched for several decades, with lots of works covering lots of exfiltration techniques. All those exfiltration techniques assume unrestricted internet connection. Clearly this is not the case in the scenarios that we look at. Also, there's a lot of work on air-gapped endpoints, the other extremities, and it's great and amusing work from a Ben Gurion University research group, but all those attacks require eventually that the attacker is in close physical proximities, can be either somewhere between meters and hundreds of meters from the network. This is, again, a very most restricting requirement that we do not have in our technology. There are some works on third-party sites, on exfiltration via third-party sites that could have been theoretically be applied in this situation where the third-party site is the update server from Microsoft or from the antivirus, but from reasons that we go into in details in our white paper, all those techniques are irrelevant because we are talking about an update server, not a regular browsing website, not a regular website. There's a lot of research, of course, on antivirus sandboxes. There's great research discussing all kind of properties of antivirus sandboxes, but all that research leaked data from the sandboxes themselves, not from the endpoint of an enterprise. So again, lovely research, but does not help directly in our case. And there's one case of Tavis Ormandy leaking data from the endpoint using the Komodo sandbox. But again, this research assumed that there is no restriction on the internet connections from the endpoint. So again, less relevant in our case. And so we really are convinced that this is a new and much improved attack over existing techniques and technologies. So here is the technique that we devised. We need two building blocks. One is the ability for malicious code to trigger an antivirus event. And in one of the previous links, in the slides that I just went through, has a very nice compilation of such triggering of techniques to trigger an antivirus product. And due to time restrictions, we only used two very simple triggers. One is writing the icar file to disk. Icar file is a standard 68 bytes, a non-Windows 32 executable file that is by definition supposed to be detected by each and every antivirus product. The other one is installing is having the malware install itself or persist itself on the machine in question, on the endpoint, by moving or copying its binary to under the Windows startup folder. Of course, there are tons of other triggering techniques. These are but very simple two techniques, but even with those two simple techniques, we got very interesting and meaningful results. The second building block is simply exfiltrating data from an internet-connected machine with no internet restriction or with reasonable internet restrictions. Again, there are multiple ways of doing that. The slide about exfiltration at large lists some 3 papers that provide compilation of such techniques. And again, due to time restrictions, we had to limit ourselves to only 2 techniques. One is simply sending an HTTP or HTTPS request to the attacker host, where the HTTP body section contains the data to be exfiltrated. And the second one is slightly more sophisticated, and it involves forcing a DNS resolution to an attacker-owned domain and using a subdomain that contains the data to be exfiltrated. Of course, the subdomain can only contain a small chunk of such data. So a series of DNS queries are needed effectively to exfiltrate large amounts of data. And the idea here is that using DNS resolutions, or by forcing a DNS resolution using get host by name or get ADDR info, the malware tells the operating system to resolve this host name. The operating system uses its configured DNS resolver to actually do the resolution. And the DNS resolver has to do all the hard DNS work, starting from the root server, theoretically, and going all the way through the authoritative name server that is owned by the attacker and which is served by the attacker's authoritative name server. So the final step in resolution has the DNS resolver sending the host name to the authoritative DNS server owned by the attacker, and the attacker just needs to extract the subdomain or the host name, the host part of the DNS name, and assemble it, collect all those queries, assemble them, and get them, deserialize them back into the original message, the data to be exfiltrated. So, and now I'm going to describe the technique. Again, as the assumptions that we make are that we have an antivirus product, an agent, installed on endpoints, and it submits samples to the antivirus cloud. This submission can be directly by establishing a connection to the antivirus server, or indirectly by sending this file to the antivirus management server and have the management server send it to the antivirus cloud. And the cloud service uses a sandbox which can directly connect to the internet. That's the secret sauce of the part of the secret sauce. And the attacker process is, or malware is assumed to be already running on the endpoint. How do we get an endpoint to be infected in the first place is out of scope for this research. Obviously, we can use several techniques, and I'm sure that you're familiar and don't need to really go over the techniques for infection, but in this case, think, for example, about infected or malicious USB stick. And the attack flow goes as following. We are going to use two components. One is the main malware, we call it the rocket. The rocket is responsible for the data collection, the sensitive data collection. It can collect documents, PowerPoint slides, Excel files, database queries and database files, whatnot from the endpoint. And the rocket contains a copy inside it, inside the binary, inside the process memory. It contains a small additional executable we call the satellite. And the satellite is responsible for the actual exfiltration. It has logic for triggering the antivirus agent, and also it has logic for a generic exfiltration. So as we said, the assumption, the zeroth step, is to have the machine, the endpoint, infected with the main malware of the rocket. As you can see, the rocket contains the satellite inside it. Then the rocket collects the sensitive data from the endpoint and embeds it into the satellite. The satellite has inside its own binary, the satellite has a static buffer pre-allocated, and into this buffer the rocket writes the sensitive data to be exfiltrated, or let's call it the payload. Then the rocket writes the satellite with the collected data inside it to disk and executes it using, for example, a system or any other standard execution method. So now two malicious processes are running side by side. The original main malware, the rocket, and the satellite, which contains inside its binary form the collected data. Now the satellite runs its triggering logic, and so it triggers the antivirus agent. The antivirus agent maybe quarantines the satellite or stops the satellite, but also sends this sample to the cloud for further inspection. Now in the cloud, the antivirus server opens this sample into a sandbox and runs it inside the sandbox. The sandbox, I remind you, allows some form of internet connection. And so the satellite uses this internet connection to send the data to the attacker's command and control server. We have a market share research from OpsWatch showing 11 leading antivirus vendors. We, again, due to time restrictions, we only tested 10 of them. We had to omit Spybot. And the results are that Avira, Antivirus Pro, ESET, Node 32, Kaspersky Total Security, and Komodo Client Security were found vulnerable to this attack technique. So 4 out of 10. Do notice that this attack technique is not too subtle. We are triggering an antivirus agent, so we're expecting some pop-ups and logs and audits and whatnot. But it's also, at the same time, too late for the enterprise to react. The data is already on its way to the cloud, and once it gets executed, sometimes within seconds, the data is practically exfiltrated. While doing this research, we collected a lot of insights on cloud antivirus sandboxes. Some sandboxes like ESET blocked HTTP but not DNS. Some sandboxes blocked access to environment variables, so when we try to enumerate them, we'd get an empty list. Some have non-standard software and environment variables. We'll see an example shortly. Of interest is the fact that the somewhat surprising fact that cloud antivirus sandboxes do not try to hide themselves. In almost all of them, at least one of the below list was static or indicative of sandboxing. The computer name, disk volume serial number, MAC address, which is either static or indicative of sandboxing, like for example VMware, the VMware vendor MAC, and performance counter frequency, which again can be indicative of sandboxing. Some sandbox infrastructure is shared among several vendors. Lead time from submission to getting data exfiltrated varied wildly. We have sub-minutes actually. We had some cases where it took 10 or 20 seconds to cases where it took 2 to 3 hours. Also of peculiarity is that we saw some cases where multiple executions were carried out. So we kind of assume that when a sample is uploaded to the sandbox, to the cloud, it gets executed once in the sandbox. Well, clearly that's not always the case. Sometimes it is executed multiple times. And finally, somewhat amusing is that some antivirus agents also started getting suspicious about the Rocket, the main malware, and they noticed that this main malware contains a small executable inside it. So they extracted this small executable, the satellite, in its vanilla form, that is before data was embedded into it, and executed it this vanilla sandbox satellite inside the sandbox. So at first it was a great surprise, but later we figured out what's going on. We extracted 37 sandbox computer names, and somewhat interestingly, in 2015, 2 years ago, Hexacorn published a list of over 800 names of antivirus sandboxes, and our list coincided with the Hexacorn long list in 7 cases. So 7 out of the 37 names are ones that were known to be sandbox antivirus sandbox computer names in 2015. So we see that this world is slowly changing, but on the other hand, that in some cases it did not change for over 2 years. And here's an example of the environment variables from a particular Komodo sandbox machine. This machine does not make any attempt to hide its MAC address, disk volume number, or domain, which remains static throughout multiple executions on that particular machine. But had it actually tried to randomize the MAC address, disk volume number, and domain, we'd still be able to detect it. How? Because we have some environment variables that are interconnected, or that are related, for example, or in this case. So there are actually 2 representations of the present time in the left-hand side of the bottom bullets. One uses a human-readable format with 3 environment variables, temp H, temp M, and temp S, representing hours, minutes, and seconds. And the other one is this T now, which is the seconds since midnight. So these two represent actually the same quantity, the time of day, in 2 different ways. So if we find a machine that has this combination of environment variables, we can tell that this is the Komodo sandbox. Likewise, we have another set of environment variables that represent the time plus 202 seconds. Not sure what this magic number represents, possibly a time limit for a sandbox execution. And again, 2 representations of the same time. And again, enabling us to detect this sandbox as a Komodo sandbox, even if the obvious MAC address, disk volume number, and domain are randomized. We kept talking about cloud sandboxes, but in fact, this research also applies to on-premise antivirus sandboxes, which are considered a more secure alternative to cloud antivirus sandboxes. But if those on-premise antivirus sandboxes allow internet connections, and the enterprise firewall also allows internet connection, or there's subsets, 2 subsets of internet connections that have non-empty intersection, then the satellite can abuse this non-empty intersection to exfiltrate data through the internet ports or protocols that are allowed both by the sandbox and by the corporate firewall, and achieve the exfiltration. We did not test this, but we assume that there are some systems out there that are vulnerable to the attack. To generalize what we just described, you can think that you can actually say that any sample sharing outside the enterprise, or in case of on-premise sandbox, even inside the enterprise, can facilitate exfiltration. So we should be wary of security mailing lists and file or sample repositories or expert analysis services. If we provide them with executables from our enterprise, we can, by that action, facilitate exfiltration. And particularly when we are looking at the submission to VirusTotal and friends, this becomes a real problem. If such services, if online or cloud sandbox or scanning services are used as a backend for malware detection engines, then this becomes a problem. And and of course, if VirusTotal or Joe Sandbox or payload security products, services, are used manually, then obviously if this sample we share happens to be a satellite type of sample, then we actually facilitate exfiltration. And we did manage to do that with Google VirusTotal, with Joe Security Sandbox Cloud, and payload security hybrid analysis. So, for a little demo, I'm handing it over to Itzik.
Thank you. So, as Amit has presented, we have released a tool that basically I'm going to demo it. The tool right now is already on GitHub, so once Amit will present his computer back, you can see the URL and download. Okay, let's see. Cool. So the tool name is SpaceBin, and basically what it does is exactly what Amit described. We have developed 2 components. One of them is the rocket, one of them is the satellite. And I'm going to make a presentation here that shows exactly how it works. So the first time, what I'm going to show right now is a local simulation on my own laptop. So basically this is a Windows 10 machine running within my Mac. And I'm going to compile right now a rocket and a simulation. And the purpose of that exercise is to leak the string allow DC25. So we are using Python basically to generate a C++ skeleton, and within the skeleton we embed the actual file, the actual strings that we would like to extract from that purpose company. As a way to embed the information, we're using a magic number, so we're not actually compile anything. The satellite, as Amit presented, the vanilla version, basically contains a buffer within the executable, which is then will be rewritten with the information once the attacker wants to extract it. So the process that happened right now, I've compiled the rocket. Sorry? Bigger? Okay, I'll try to make it a little bit bigger. So we have compiled the actual, hold up one second. Yeah. Okay, so we have actually run a Python script. That Python script generated a C++ file that will be the rocket. And in it, we provided the string that we'd like to steal. That string was a low DC25. Obviously, as a POC, that's the purpose of it. It can be enhanced to do actual more files and whatnot. Again, in order to overcome the idea of how we will write the information in real time, we've allocating the buffer and using these magic numbers to basically know exactly within the executable where we can rewrite with the actual information. So the satellite, once it's executed, and here it's named DPP, is going to try a number of different ways to basically communicate outside. So the first one will be DNS, and the second one will be a bunch of different ports. So let's see that it's working. Let's see that I have an internet connection. Okay. And so basically for the purpose of this exercise, Amit and we have registered a domain. And this domain, we basically own the name server, as you can see here. And basically we have received this hit on our tail, which means that we have actually communicated from my Windows 10 through DNS tunneling to our server. So just to prove that the information that is packed here is the same as we have initially decided, let's decode the base64 string and see what's the output. Obviously, we need to make sure it's paired completely. And as you can see, it's the same string that we intended to leak in the beginning. We have enhanced the tool ever since, and we have created a version which allows also to try different TCP and UDP sockets, again, all for the purpose to examine what kind of information can be now stolen from the sandbox. As Amit presented, there's two types of sandboxes. We're going to present a demo that we have recorded with VirusTotal. So we're actually going to present how is it going to look like if somebody is going to use VirusTotal, and I'm basically going to narrate it as I'm playing the demo over here. So as you can see here, we have a split for 3 screens. On the left side, the upper left side of the screen, we're going to basically bind a bunch of very common TCP and UDP ports from the assumption that if the sandbox is open, that will allow the information to flow through. On the bottom, as you can see, we're going to tail our bind DNS service, and again, in the hope to see if the sandbox will allow the DNS request to go out. We are now compiling on the right side, that's the hacker point of view, we're actually compiling the same rocket as I've tested on my computer. Here, we're going to use a different payload. Now, stepping into VirusTotal, that's the same website that you guys are seeing, the same website that you guys are using. I have no special access to it or no special mode. The rationale behind this particular demo is imagine that you're a threat analyst, a SOC analyst, there's some kind of a sample that you'd like to examine. Now you're going to go to VirusTotal, you're going to submit that sample. So far, so good. Sounds like a very solid workflow. So I'm going to do exactly that. I'm going to upload the created satellite into VirusTotal, and it will start processing. It will take about a minute till it will actually connect back. Take into consideration the order that these sandboxes are being activated. We cannot control it. As Amit specified, it can be seconds, minutes, or hours. In this particular demo, it's about a minute. So as you can see, VirusTotal is actually processing the sample, doing what it's always doing. Now let's put attention on the left side of the screen. What's going to happen here is that we're going to see information coming both on the TCP/UDP sockets as well as on the DNS. So let's let it run its course. In reality, I spend a lot of time in front of that screen waiting for results to show up. I just shorted it here in the demo. Thank you. So what we're seeing on the left side is that VirusTotal totally allow connection to these different ports, anything from 6667 IRC all the way to NTP 123 UDP and other popular services. The string that I've used is Hello Blackhead 2017. That was our previous talk, so we prepared the demo for that one. On the bottom side of the screen, we can also see hits on our DNS server, meaning that we actually also allow, DNS tunneling is also a possibility to run from VirusTotal. What I'm going to do now in the demo is I'm going to take, again, the base64 encoded string, and I'm going to decode it, and it was supposed to be the same string that I've sent in the beginning, which is the Hello Blackhead 2017. And that's that. So again, just to kind of quickly recap what we've seen right now. So what we've seen is a malware contains another malware, and that the secondary malware will try to communicate out from the sandbox on two different methods. One is the DNS tunneling, as shown in the lower bottom of the screen, and then on the try to create open sockets on regular services and try to communicate the string out. So back to you, Amit.
Thank you, Itzik. All right. So obviously we informed the affected vendors. 3 of them, Avira, ESET, and Komodo, fixed their sandboxes. I'll soon explain how. In fact, Avira did that in less than half a day. Kaspersky, on the other hand, opted not to fix. They said that they offered several workarounds, but they do not address the core issue in their offering. We also got, by the way, a nice acknowledgement email document from ESET, so it's very nice of them. So that's about antivirus vendors. As for cloud sandboxes, analysis services, I should say very honestly that we do not consider the issue to be a vulnerability in their services. After all, the services are not committed to or not supposed to prevent exfiltration from endpoint machines which are totally not in their jurisdiction. However, we notified all 3 vendors. VirusTotal told us that internet connections are needed are actually a feature. It's needed for the analysis of the samples. Joe Security decided to fix, and Payload Security decided not to comment. So what can a cloud antivirus do in such case? The obvious suggestion is simply to block all traffic to the internet from the sandbox, but we can be a bit more delicate and and only allow a sample to interact with the internet if the sample arrives from the internet. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that if a sample gets from the internet to an endpoint, but the AV agent knows that the sample on disk is byte-wise identical, or MD5 or SHA-2 identical to the sample to the binary that arrived from the internet, then it's safe to send it to the sandbox for a full internet access analysis. However, there's a subtle issue here. It's not enough for the sample to arrive from outside the endpoint. Think about an enterprise wherein the 2 endpoints are infected. And in one of them, the rocket spawns a satellite, and sends the satellite to the second infected machine. Now, the second rocket in the second infected machine executes the satellite. The antivirus looks at the satellite and figures that it's identical to the copy that arrived on wire to the second endpoint, and so it's quote-unquote safe for full internet access sandbox analysis. But that's not the case, because this satellite arrived from within the enterprise and it may contain embedded in it sensitive enterprise information. So the sample should arrive from outside the enterprise, should arrive from the real internet. And obviously this suggestion does not apply to cloud scanning and analysis services like VirusTotal, who are clueless about the origins of the sample that's uploaded to them. From the offensive point of view, there are some research directions that we identified. Again, our research was conducted with some time and resource restrictions, but we do have some ideas where this research can be, or how this research can be extended. One is obviously to implement additional antivirus triggers. We are not 100% sure we managed to trigger all the antiviruses that we tested in the lab. Another idea is to add more exfiltration methods. As I mentioned earlier, we only used HTTP and DNS in our research. Obviously, we could have tried SMTP, IRC, ICMP, and lots of protocols and techniques to exfiltrate data. One thing that can help the rocket to evade detection or to evade getting suspicious is encrypting and or compressing the satellite, the vanilla satellite that it carries inside it. Also, when it embeds the collected data, it would be a good idea to compress and encrypt the collected data inside the satellite. And finally, a bit more radical idea would be to simulate the antivirus agent to cloud the server protocol. This would allow the rocket, the main malware, to submit the satellite directly to the antivirus server instead of having to trigger the local antivirus agent. And this, in turn, first relieves us from the need to trigger the antivirus agent, but even more importantly, can result in less conspicuous or less obvious trails that something fishy is going on. There will probably won't be any pop-ups as the ones we captured a few slides ago, and maybe even less logs, or maybe with some tampering and some sophistication, maybe almost no logs at all from this submission, and so it's more evasive. To conclude this research and what we've seen, we summarize it in 3 points. First one is that antivirus products using internet-connected sandboxes can facilitate exfiltration, even when very strict restrictions are applied, are enforced on the endpoints. This applies both for in the cloud sandbox, which is the main object of our study, but also on on-premise sandbox. We generalize that and say that sharing suspicious or malicious files can facilitate exfiltration unless the file has arrived from the internet and is unmodified. And this particularly applies to uploading samples to online or cloud scanning or analysis services like VirusTotal and Friends, but also any sample sharing at large, sending a sample to mailing lists or sharing it with security experts and so forth. Finally, particularly for antivirus products, Avira, ESET, and Komodo fixed their sandboxes so that they no longer allow internet connections, so they're apparently safe. Kaspersky is presently known to be vulnerable, unless, of course, its users use any of those workarounds suggested by Kaspersky. And with other vendors, we can't positively say that they are not vulnerable, because we only studied a very small set of triggering techniques and exfiltration techniques. But obviously, more research should be applied in this area. And we'd like to thank Yoni Friedberg for his help in setting the antivirus research lab. Thank you, Yoni, wherever you are. Thank you all for attending our session.